The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP at 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you are interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you are free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up using any of the content. If you like, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. This week I had the chance to talk to Sasha, who is a community organizer in the Triangle area of North Carolina, about ongoing organizing to help rebuild and continue to aid folks after the multiple hurricanes recently hit this region. I won't say much about this interview right now for time's sake, but what I will say is that this interview went in directions that I couldn't have predicted, and really went on a deep dive of how to conceptualize of disaster relief in our changing climate, in addition to more practical topics. I hope that you enjoy it.
If you're in the Asheville area this week, Blue Ridge Anarchist Black Cross has two upcoming events. On Friday, November 2nd at 6:30 p.m. at Firestorm Books and Coffee, Bravick will be airing the latest episode of Trouble, a mini-documentary series by Submedia. This month's episode is focused on the J20 inauguration conspiracy case that ended up some months ago. It's kind of a bad penny that keeps showing up. This will be followed by a brief chat about the film and the case. This event happens the same time, same place, every first Friday of the month, and is a great way to get your weekend started. And on Sunday, November 4th at 5 p.m., just a little after next week's episode of our show on this station, Bravick will also be hosting their monthly political prisoner letter writing night at, you guessed it, Firestorm. ABC will be bringing info on prisoners whose birthdays are coming up, or who are facing repression or coming up for parole. We'll provide materials and a friendly atmosphere to help in writing letters to prisoners. If you've ever thought of writing someone in prison before, but have been overwhelmed by the prospect of it, this is a great way to get started. We don't frequently comment on this show about ongoing events that we aren't either announcing or featuring on the episode, but this is a rare example. This week saw a couple of racist attacks that we wanted to mention in case you missed them. These are at least the ones that came to my eyes. In order to point out the continued and intensifying need for anti-racist and anti-fascist organizing, research, and street presence. On October 24th, a white man named Gregory Bush allegedly failed to break into a black church in Louisville, Kentucky, and instead decided to shoot a black man, Maurice E. Stallard, inside of a Kroger, and a black woman, Vicki Lee Jones, in the parking lot of that Kroger, killing both of them. The shooter told a witness, quote, "Whites don't shoot whites," unquote. Yesterday, on Saturday, October 27th, during Shabbat service, a gunman with white nationalist ties named Robert D. Bowers entered the Tree of Life Congregation Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and killed 11 congregants while wielding an AR-15 and 2 handguns, injuring 3 other congregants. These are just 2 recent examples of white rage acting out against others. A visible trend and not out of sync with the settler, colonial, and anti-black violence that is the United States, yet undeniably horrendous. The victims' families are in our hearts, as are all of the many unmentioned victims of reactionary violence. On this note, we're including a couple of anti-racist announcements folks can join in on if they care to. This is me literally stealing a line from the latest Hot Wire episode from Crime Think, quote, "To mark the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht and to push back against the uptick in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and xenophobic violence around the world, there is a Jewish call for International Days Against Fascism and Anti-Semitism. The call reads, quote, on November 8th through 11th, we will sing out and celebrate the survival of our peoples. We will say Kaddish for those who gave their lives in the fight against fascism, We will engage in acts of karam and ritually excommunicate those Jews who aid and abet fascists of our time. And we will march on the institutions, the political parties, and the private businesses that collaborate with their genocidal agenda. At the same time, we will show the world that the real threat to our security as Jews isn't our Muslim neighbors, but, quote, Western chauvinists, unquote, Christian supremacists, and white nationalists, the would-be pogromists of our day. Starting now and continuing through the year 5779 and beyond, we will rebuild an international network of anti-fascist Jews and our allies. From the streets where we live to the places we work and play, we will organize to defend all of our communities from those who would exterminate us. We invite you to join us in the fight for a world without pogroms, for a future without fascism, unquote. This call is using a hashtag, quote, anti-fascist fall, hashtag cancel them, and hashtag outlive them. More information can be found at outlivethem.wordpress.com. Also, Atlanta anti-fascists are asking folks to contact Atlanta's John Marshall Law School about one of its students, Casey Jordan Cooper. Cooper has made explicit lynching threats against black students, has organized alt-right efforts around the school, and has documented connections to white nationalists like Sam Dixon. Alongside a bunch of really amazing research that AFA and ATL has done, you can find more about Casey Jordan Cooper, including a video and a 500-plus page dossier on him, the request for a call-in on Monday, October 29th to the university, and a script to help you along up at atlantaantifa.org. We don't need any more Nazi lawyers, and this school should be ashamed to continue to hold Cooper as a student, considering its lip service to the importance of students providing non-prejudicial service to their clients. Big shout out to some comrades in Western North Carolina who carefully and soberly infiltrated a new chapter of the white nationalist grouping Patriot Front and were able to disrupt their activities during an attempted banner drop. This sort of high level of engagement is dangerous and not to be taken lightly, but can be quite effective at gaining intelligence on the enemy and ruining their days. More info on this can be found on a linked IGD article that we'll have in our show notes. Finally, in prisoner news, 2 affiliates of the new African Black Panther Party prison chapter are in the news. Keith Malik Washington, whose supporters have been on this show before, shared that he's on a hunger strike at McConnell Administrative Segregation Unit in Texas in protest against his continued repression and repeated medical endangerment. More info on that can be found at comrademalik.com. Also, Kevin Rashid Johnson, who we spoke to in September. He has been refused medical aid by the guards at Sussex 2, where he's been transferred. He's been denied the ability to send and receive mail, including legal mail. He has been threatened with dogs while chained up, kept in his cell 24/7, and other terrible circumstances since he's been there roughly 20 days. You can visit rashidmod.com for more details and the numbers and officials that you can call to protest on his behalf.
Thank you so much for taking time to do this interview with me. If you would like to, would you say your name and talk a little bit about what you do?
Sure. My name is Sasha, and basically what I've been up to for the last month, I've been organizing a couple of different mutual aid projects out of a space here in Durham. So that can be anything from, coordinating supply drop-offs in areas out on the East Coast, doing load pickups for a bunch of donation sites that we have here and across the triangle, putting people in touch with each other, honestly, sorting stuff, anything that needs doing to kind of help with the relief effort we've got going on right now. That's been my gig for the last month and a half.
That's amazing. That sounds like a lot of work.
It has been, yeah.
So you mentioned you're based sort of in the Triangle area, which, if people aren't familiar with North Carolina, it's not amidst most of the worst damage that was done, at least during Hurricane Florence, but it's really not far from it. Would you describe how it's been in your area regarding hurricane damage and, solidarity efforts or solidarity needs that you've seen so far?
Yeah, well, like you said, the triangle here wasn't terribly affected by Florence. We had a little bit of rain, a few power outages here and there, but Florence didn't hit us too hard. It's ironic. Michael, as it came through, coming up from the Panhandle in Florida, it actually kind of took us by surprise and caused a bit more harm here in the triangle than Florence actually did, which was unexpected and I think caught people a little bit off guard. What has really been hit hard by Florence was towns and communities across the east, like the southeastern coast. So from New Bern, Kinston, all the way down to like the bottom of Brunswick County and down into South Carolina just got hit super hard.
Mm-hmm.
There were, massive amounts of flooding from all of the rain that the hurricane brought in, that like as the rain traveled down south through the watershed of North Carolina, it like the water began to crest all the way down the southern coast of the state, and town after town just got hit with these crazy floodwaters, power outages. The flooding devastated a lot of the hog farms, and there was been, people have been pulling pigs out of the water. People with like roofs caved in and their homes being gutted because of the flooding damage and the black mold that's been developing there. The hurricane affected a lot here in the area.
Yeah, definitely. It really sounds like it. And it's been like maybe a little bit over a week since Hurricane Michael. Are there things that like have been done to sort of repair the fairly extensive damage, or what still needs to be done in your opinion?
I mean, definitely people are still in the middle of what I kind of consider phase 2 of the hurricane relief, which is, dealing with the consequences of the flooding, mostly towards people's homes. So in terms of needs, I'm thinking people are still absolutely prioritizing, power tools, things for getting trees out of the area, cleaning supplies so that they can start trying to get this mold out of their home. Anybody with construction or experience, that's going to be really helpful, because a lot of folks don't necessarily have the skills to, deal with the aftermath in their homes. So anything like that is still going to be really necessary right now.
And the issue with the hog farms is like one that I understand has a huge amount of history in the area, what with like the runoff from the hog farms being a huge, environmental and like quality of life concern for communities, and also like they being located in some of the poorest counties in North Carolina, and like there not being like proper sort of like hygiene measures put in place. So yeah, thanks for like, and in addition to the like, I hesitate to say humanitarian issue of like people leaving the pigs to just die, like to just drown. So yeah, thanks for bringing that one up too.
Well, yeah, I mean, on some of my trips out to the coast, I've seen the hog farms and I've seen the lagoons full of, literal pig shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse, but...
Yeah, let's say whatever you want.
Yeah. Word. Okay, then it's like literal lagoons full of pig shit, and it's exactly as you said. Not only is it like a massive ecological disaster in and of itself that these farms exist, there's like a kind of cross-pollination between that and this very explicit environmental racism, where they're located in working class like black communities, in like poor as fuck white communities, and indigenous communities all across the eastern coast of North Carolina. So it's very much that as the devastation comes in and affects the state, it's being stacked on top of this level of dispossession and devastation that's already been there, and basically since North Carolina has existed. So yeah, it's a lot of things working against each other.
Well, I would love to talk about sort of what has been going on as far as autonomous disaster relief efforts in the area. So people have set up a distribution point in Durham for coordinating supply drops to be sent further east. What kinds of coordination were necessary to make this project a reality?
In the first place, we needed a space. This experience has really demonstrated for me how absolutely critical our practice has to be connected towards space, because if we didn't have this area where we could all like come together and work on things together and kind of share projects and information in this very kind of open, accessible way, I really don't think that what we've been doing would have been as effective. At first, we definitely needed a space that could be open, where we could come in and do whatever we needed to get done for this. In addition to that, logistically, we really needed drop-off points across the entire area where people could, bring donations and supplies, or also sign up for kind of volunteering. And the distro space here in Durham has acted as one of those pickup sites. And we've also had, like grocery stores and co-ops and things like that all across the area that have been doing this for us. And in addition to those drop-off sites, what we needed were also points of contact across the entire eastern coast, both spaces and people, where we could, deploy out to with a bunch of supplies and organize drop-offs for people. So kind of those three layers are really necessary for what we've been doing. And then, just the obvious things of like vehicles and stuff to go back and forth and take supplies and all of that.
Yeah, and it sounds a lot like, it sounds like a huge sort of, time commitment, like you said, but also I'm really interested in like informal infrastructure building in this way that like is predicated on, like a really attentive and sustained like solidarity building, because it seems like people don't just like leap up and do this stuff. Would it be a correct assessment to say that like it takes like a lot of solidarity building over the course of many years to like make this kind of thing a reality?
I think in order to make it a long-term reality, it would take that kind of work. What's happened here did materialize very quickly, at least from my perspective. I've never done this kind of work before. I've read a lot about mutual aid, certainly in the recent past with things like Hurricane Irma. There's been a lot of opportunity to see what people can do, but this has been the first chance I've ever had to kind of put this practice to the test and see if we could make this work in a way that is both autonomous and better than what the state or the nonprofits can do. So I think that was the case for a lot of people. And I think that in the beginning, there was this massive like momentum of energy and initiative to self-organize in a way that felt really powerful. But now I am seeing like people needing to take a step back and kind of take some rest for themselves and build their energy back up, because this work has been really tiring. In terms of making this a more sustainable project, I do think that what we're going to come away with is a whole lot of person-to-person connections that, the next time something like this happens, because this is going to continue to happen, we'll know who to call and we'll know who has what, and we'll be able to kind of activate in a way that feels more familiar and that we're more comfortable with, and maybe not with so many of the hiccups and the questions that we had when we started out doing this.
Yeah, definitely, especially, since these are autonomous efforts that are not funded by, things like, I mean, we all know that the Red Cross is garbage, but like,
Yeah.
and FEMA is also like garbage, but not funded by anything other than like working class people taking money out of their own pockets and taking time away from their jobs, and like emotional and physical resources, like you said, and people needing time to just regenerate after this work, which I know has saved a lot of people.
I mean,
Yeah.
I hope that that's the case. I know that we've absolutely done our best to try and help as many people as we can, because, you know, at some point, maybe not with a hurricane, but it's going to be for some other reason that people here in the Triangle are hurting and, you know, will need help. And hopefully the people that we've built connections with will help us in those moments. We can't count on anyone but each other. You know, we can't count on the state to do it, and we can't count on these fucking corporations to do it. At the end of the day, when shit really is going to hit the fan, we're not going to have anyone but ourselves. So I hope that what we've done has helped a lot of people. I really hope so.
Yeah, I've definitely heard stories that would corroborate that from people on the ground. Maybe this is a really good segue into this other question of like long-term autonomous disaster relief infrastructure. So as climate change just becomes, you know, worse and worse and worse, and I think we only have to look at the evidence of our own eyes to, you know, see that that is the case. What are some things that you think, based on your own direct experience of doing this work, that people around, you know, anyone who's listening should start doing or keeping in mind in terms of a sustainable way for this kind of autonomous work?
I think at first there are a couple of really necessary logistical things that people would want to invest in. That looks like pickup trucks and, you know, boats with outboard engines, so that when, you know, the water levels start rising, you can still get somewhere. Because what I found, the situation I found myself in was, my friend was down in Wilmington, and, you know, the last message I received from them was, hey guys, there's a flood, like a river flooding through our backyard right now. Power's about to go out. Don't know if I'll be able to reach you. So I was about to go rent a U-Haul and drive my happy ass down to Wilmington to go and find them. But by the time that was happening, the water levels were so high that the roads were completely impassable, and I was stuck. So I think the first things that people can equip themselves with are, you know, really vehicles in order to get back and forth and, you know, through an emergency terrain, and to be able to move supplies. That's going to be really important. Buy gas cans and fill them up. Try and grab generators so that you have them. I think things like comms, radios were very important, both on like within the local context, because we thought that we were going to lose power when it still seemed like it was going to come and hit straight on, and when we were doing supply runs out on the coast. Power tools, anything that you'll need for like clearing trees and hauling debris and garbage away, that's going to be important. And then, you know, outside of just all of those logistical concerns, what you really need to do is begin, again, communicating with each other. Find out who has what inventory of supplies. Find out who has, you know, connections to bars and farmers markets and co-ops and towns. Figure out who has construction skills and cooking skills, and who speaks multiple languages, so that you can translate for folks who are more marginalized and don't speak English as their primary language. And start doing all of this now, because if you do, you know, we did not have a head start when Florence came. There are more hurricanes and natural disasters coming, and people can start investing time and money into this, you know, infrastructure and this skill set, so that when the next one comes, they'll be prepared.
Definitely. Yeah, and like I imagine that, some sort of preemptive fundraising, though it's like hard to fundraise when there isn't like a fire under the collective ass or
Oh,
whatever,
yeah.
might be help in that as well.
Building a communal fund for these kinds of needs is definitely a head priority that I would suggest folks get started with now. What I have noticed though was that the window for people's attention with this hurricane was very small. Even before Michael was announced, energy and attention was already beginning to wane here in the triangle. And that was in a matter of like 3 or 4 weeks. So in terms of fundraising, people need to strike when that iron is hot because it cools down really fast.
Yeah, and that's just such a brutal reality for things like these. People, I've been noticing a lot that people are really sort of energized when it's like and I don't really mean to minimize anybody's pain by saying this because I'm trying to like talk about it in media terms, but like when things are a sexy disaster, people
Mm,
are like really into it, but like when people are like, hey, it's been 3 weeks and like my house is still full of mold, or like the roads are still impassable, or like my baby doesn't have enough to eat, then people are like less willing to pay attention. Have you located a magic window for attention grab? I mean, I hate to be like opportunistic about this kind of thing, but like, do you think it's at all useful to like talk about the magic window for attention?
I just think, I mean, honestly, that window is, I would say it opens from the moment you know that the hurricane is coming towards you. And I think that just in terms of autonomous preparation, like we have to build a better practice of watching and being
Mm.
ready because I was caught off guard with Hurricane Florence, and I think a lot of people in town were caught off guard with this hurricane coming. So I think from the moment that these storms are brought to our attention, that's the time when you start putting out asks for support and you start getting ready as best as you can. Because I would say that the window began closing the moment the roads started opening again. When the roads were closed and no one could get in, and an audience of spectators could still watch this crisis situation of we can't get in. That was when it was still interesting to people, and that was when people were still willing to engage as audience members. That stopped the moment the roads, the moment the flooding receded a bit and the roads opened up and relief could get in. That's the moment when people are going to begin to taper off. So I would definitely say keep that in mind and be ready.
Yeah. Yeah, and like to be clear, I think that the like magic window is pretty much useful for like fundraising purposes when I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like it seems to be more useful for fundraising purposes among like non-locals or like at a national level. But is it a thing with local attention as well?
I think it's applicable almost at every scale because at the local context we weren't affected here in the triangle. You know, what really becomes powerful and like a driving force of initiative in these moments is when there's this shared situation that everyone is a part of. My friends talk about in Wilmington the time that they spent there where everybody was out in the streets because the storm had kind of pulled people out of their homes to just try and find out even what was going on, what the
Mhm.
situation was. And that contact between everyone really kind of like gets the juices going. Here
Mhm.
in town, that didn't really ever happen because the storm didn't hit here. So I would say that most of the situation here in the triangle remained that kind of spectator relation where it was folks watching what was going on outside of the area, and some folks doing what they thought was the best way that they could help, bringing in donations, and that was really helpful, or like giving folks money, which was very helpful. But it was still very much that situation of, well, I see what's going on, but I'm not a part of this situation. And eventually local attention kind of fell off the same way that I think national attention kind of fell off.
Thank you so much for going into that. I think it's an important aspect of this kind of situation, just because of how people's attention span works and the ways in which it's been influenced by like media and fiction representations of this kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's super real. I'm not exactly sure like what to do with that information, other than just like acknowledge it. Do you have any thoughts on like how this information could be like utilized or weaponized or so on?
Do you mean in terms of people's attention span and in terms of their memory?
Yeah, basically. Rather than being like, y'all suck, like you're not paying attention anymore, which is a thing that I see people do, which is fine because like frustration is real. But yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
In the first place, I think that a huge part of how this system works is through terror, right? There's this very widespread attitude that I've seen, at least in my past experience with like lefty circles, where the attitude towards folks is, they don't understand what's going on to them, and that's because they're ignorant or they're not intelligent enough or they're not smart enough to be able to know what I know about the situation, and they just don't get it, and so that's their problem. But I don't think that this system is sustained so much through ignorance as it is through terror, through this like deeply psychological grounding in fear. And part of how that operates is through constant crisis. Every single day is a crisis within this system. The fact that you have to pay rent is a crisis. The fact that you can't feed yourself is a crisis. The fact that you are surrounded by a community that you're alienated from and you didn't get to pick is a crisis. Hurricanes are a fucking crisis. And so it's this constant bombardment of all these things that are made to make us existentially afraid. And I think a huge part of dealing with that constant trauma is erasure, is like, okay, let me wipe this last problem out of my brain because I can't keep this problem and the next problem and the next problem all in my brain at the same time. And I think that's why a lot of folks will move from one issue to another, because they'll feel like, okay, I've done what I can in this last one, and now I have to let that one go because I have to try and be ready for this one that's coming. In terms of dealing with that, I don't really know. Maybe it looks something like seeing each one of these crises as, first of all, connected, and then seeing all of them as an opportunity where we can build our muscles, right? Our like autonomous muscles to deal with these situations a little bit better. And maybe part of it is thinking about thinking in like cyclical terms instead of like linear terms. Right? Because it'd be really easy for me to think that everyone has forgotten about this hurricane. But it also could be much more fruitful for me to think about, okay, we were able to generate a certain level of intensity for a certain amount of time during this hurricane. And now everyone is resting. And then when the next hurricane comes through, maybe we can generate more intensity for a longer period of time and pull more people into the situation than we did before. And maybe we can keep doing that over and over again. And maybe that rhythm of, call and response can be a way that we can hold on to these things and just keep getting better and better at responding to them. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Or the album is Ambrotos, the performer is Sleazy Rider, and the track is Dimensional Rivers. We found this up at Red and Anarchist Black Metal Blogspot, RABM. And this is a recent release by these folks. Released actually September 28th. Check them out. Greek metal is cool.
I never even say
That makes perfect sense. It's always seemed to me that like an intrinsic aspect or like a crucial aspect of mutual aid efforts is that this thing that you're getting at, which is like building on previous attempts, building on previous projects. So yeah, thanks for articulating that. I think that was super, super well said.
Thank you.
Of course, I'd love to. So a few weeks ago, or maybe a little bit like 2 weeks ago, we interviewed someone about overlooked populations in Lumberton, which is in the poorest county in North Carolina. And in part, she talked a lot about how disaster relief efforts can fall into like the same traps as other areas of structural aid, namely that those who are at the intersection of being poor and non-white generally face a high degree of neglect. And to be clear, she was like not talking about anarchist or far left organized relief efforts. She was like very effusively not talking about that. She was more talking about like the Red Cross and FEMA and how they are really, really failing communities.
Right.
But would you speak about, and you said before we were recording that you're like not an authority and this is like not a centralized effort in that way, but what is your opinion on this aspect of disaster relief work and like ways that we can turn this kind of really toxic aspect around?
I witnessed a couple of different experiences surrounding this issue during my work. One of them involved the constant presence of ICE and Border Patrol agents in towns affected across the entire state. So that was in Clinton, that was in Duplin, that was in towns all across Brunswick County, that was in Wilmington and Lumberton. And right off the bat, I really want to talk about how extraordinarily predatory it is for these agencies to deploy out to communities and surround the shelters when people are seeking aid. Because when ICE and Border Patrol is present at these shelters, that means that migrant workers and undocumented people are not going out to these shelters. So you have a community that is deeply vulnerable and already being hunted down in this country, and for the state to use a situation like this to prey on them more easily is deeply grotesque to me. Another experience that I had was just the stories that I was hearing out of Lumberton. I never had, by the time I had opportunity to go to Lumberton and, do a supply run out there, a lot of the floodwater had receded. But before that time, what I was hearing was lumbee mothers who didn't have enough formula for their children and were at the risk of having their kids die. Mm-hmm. It was friends pulling, bodies out of the water. And it was hearing about how the levees in this town broke and they went days without any contact from the state. Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, the first people who made contact in Lumberton were the Operation Airdrop folks, who were basically this, frankly, very bizarre motley crew of pilots who autonomously flew in and out of cities all across North Carolina. And then if it wasn't that, it was crews of autonomous people set up in Wilmington, North Carolina, who had this amazing distro running off the ground in a working class neighborhood of color where people were deeply affected by the hurricane, where they were doing an incredible amount of work feeding people and giving them harm reduction materials and even presenting them with literature. And they were ultimately kicked out by this, group of liberal organizers that told them, hey, we don't want poor potential drug addicts coming into the space. And, you all kind of look poor and grungy, and we don't really like the cut of your jib either. And basically, you look too fucking working class to be here, and we don't like the way you do things, so you need to get out. So it was a lot of experiences like this. So when these storms come through, it really is the most marginalized by this social order that get hit the hardest, both in terms of the devastation in the storm, the lack of access to materials after the storm, and the persecution that they're going to face from the state and from other forces, even in society, even in their own neighborhoods. It's a lot of different things. And in terms of overcoming that, I think that, one thing that we need to do is make sure that we're getting out to these communities and we're making contact with the folks who are on the ground there and building relationships with people that are based on listening and asking what is needed, as opposed to this very paternalistic kind of opinion that like, oh, I know what you need better than you do, and if you don't want my help, well, screw you, because I offered and you should have taken it. That was a lot of the attitude that we heard from a lot of people, and that shit's not helpful. And you can't build trust with people that way. And then other than that, all I can say is that I think we need to get very creative and very persistent in coming up with new ways of opening up space and supplying ourselves with the things that we need in these situations, because space is critical and supplies are critical and logistical inventory is critical, and without these things you can't operate any kind of mutual aid efforts. And so we need to get really good at finding and taking these things.
Yeah, I totally agree. I had not heard of those liberal organizers being so despicable and classist, and it's just beyond classism, it's beyond racism. It's just like, that's I mean like just as soon as I think they can't get any worse, they hear a story like that, and I'm just like, y'all, what the hell are you doing?
It got messy in Wilmington from the sound of, what I was told by multiple comrades out there who were working in these autonomous crews trying to operate this distro. Yeah, it was a mess.
It does sound like it, but I think that, we've been like trying to tangle with liberals for so long, and I think that there's a lot of like opinion within like anarchism and the far left as like how to do that. So this is a battle we've engaged in before, and I think there are a lot of opinions on how to combat that.
I'm kind of down to speak to that, actually.
Yeah,
please. Because what I've noticed in the last month and a half was that while ideology is really important, well, actually, I don't know how important I find ideology anymore. I know that it can get in the way of shit sometimes. But so much more important than ideology is people's method of doing things and how effective that method is. Because, while on the one hand, to bring up Operation Airdrop again, these folks were not by any fucking means anarchists. Most of them were very conservative people. Some of them were like libertarian kind of folks. But somehow, in spite of two entirely oppositional ideologies, we were able to work with this group of folks because we had a shared understanding of the situation. And that understanding was that the state is fucking useless. The nonprofits are useless, and they were not going to do anything about what was going on. And outside of that shared understanding of the situation and this similar methodology of acting autonomously and taking the initiative and doing for ourselves what the state won't do for us, these two entirely bizarre groups of people were able to work together and move out 70,000 pounds of supplies within a week. So I think in terms of working with the liberals, it's part sticking by our methodology and showing through practice how well it works, because it is undoubtedly effective. I have seen this work for the last month and a half. And then kind of, I don't know, I guess a willingness to put down maybe some of our own ideology when we see people willing to act in good faith. You know, the folks in Wilmington that I heard were messing with some of my crew, like, they were not willing to act in good faith. They had their ideas of exactly how things needed to go, and they weren't willing to be told otherwise. Hold on one second.
That's okay.
I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Oh, that's okay. You were talking about how people were putting down or not being willing to put down ideologies when, like, trying to coordinate with people with, like, divergent worldviews.
Right. I'm sorry, I've lost all of it. I don't know if you want to move on to the next question.
Yeah, that's totally okay. No, I was really, I think that what you said was really useful. You were, like, just talking about working with liberals, but then also, like, working with the libertarians and stuff like that. And I thought that was really useful information. But yeah, we can move on. I would love to hear about, you mentioned Operation Airdrop, which was like surprising, and I think people are still like, what the hell just happened? That was so weird and cool. But like, what sorts of other solidarity have you seen on the ground, and like what sorts of things like have worked and what didn't work and stuff like that?
It's been like a really interesting medley of different things. And I guess I kind of want to highlight that, because I feel like if we had tried to approach it from any one project or any one tactic, it wouldn't have really worked as well as like bringing all these different projects together. Mm-hmm. So for example, people were doing like supply drives in their neighborhood, and then folks were working in partner with local concerts and music events in order to do, you know, supply drives. And then, you know, I had a neighbor come up to me the other day and say that at the place where they're working, they're organizing like a whole week of donations. And so I think what came together really well was just this emphasis on initiative, on people doing whatever it was that they could. And from that, people got really creative, and I think found kind of these niches that they could move into and help however best that they could. One really interesting one that I'm excited about is that we're having a local tattoo shop. I think that they're either going to like come up with a design, or like they're going to do like half off of tattoos if you bring like a certain amount of supplies in. And I thought that was really interesting and creative, and
that's awesome.
Stuff like that has been really cool.
I do love that emphasis that you said, like the emphasis on initiative and people doing what they could, because so often I feel like people are not really knowing how to plug in or not really understanding like what to do, and that just kind of takes the question out of it, right? It's just like, well, what can you do? What are you willing to do? Then that's it, you know? And I think that that's really, really wonderful.
I think it's really hard for people to wrap their heads around that mindset, just because that's so counter to what we're taught. Like from an institutional level, even when we're very young, you are taught not to problem solve. You are taught to obey instructions and seek out authority and follow directions. You're not taught to jump into a situation that feels unfamiliar. You're not taught how you can analyze that situation, and you're really not taught how to think that situation through for yourself and figure out what your place in it is. Because if we were taught all of those things, then I think, shit could go really sideways for all these fucking capitalists and cops and politicians. But I think what really helped was the space, the distro space, and letting people come in and do that. I really want to kind of talk about that space for a minute and how magical it was for me. When we went into the warehouse, we decided for ourselves that we wanted the space to be as open as possible, and that when people came into it, we wanted them to be as autonomous as possible. We had just come out of this situation where we were working with another group of folks who told us very explicitly, this is a hierarchical organization and we've got a chain of command and we've got a way of doing things. And if you want to work out of this space with us, you're going to have to toe that line. We really rejected that outright, and we were like, no, that's not going to work for us. And luckily we were able to, open up this warehouse space. And in that space, what I've seen flourish is just this abundance of people willing to find what needs doing and just get it done without being asked. And that's goes from like this really core group of people who have been keeping the space going and operational, out to like volunteers who would come through for the day and be like, hey, I can work here today. What do y'all need doing? And then from there, we would just kind of like show them, we would help get them the lay of the land. And then we would show them this big whiteboard that we had set up with this breathing list of tasks of things that people like wanted to see done or thought was a really good idea, or even just something really cool to the space. And then people could pick from themselves what it is that they wanted to do for the day. And any day you could come into the warehouse and you could sort supplies if we had new loads being brought in, or you could pick up the distro phone and coordinate a supply drop off for the afternoon, or you could pour over the maps that like people just kind of put up on the walls one day and see, what spaces or cities we hadn't explored yet to see if people needed help. And it was just this really amazing space where every single day new people were coming in and new things were going up on the walls. And there was just this absence of policing and micromanaging, and people were just doing things all on their own. They were just finding them and doing them. And it is the most inspiring example of like an autonomous zone that I have ever been able to see in my life so far. And I find that invaluable. It was really invaluable to me, and I feel like to other people who were a part of it.
It sounds that way, and just hearing you talk about it is just like bringing me so much joy, because like you said, it's just so counter to how we are taught to operate. It's so counter to like how capital dictates that we operate, and how and it makes me feel like, and I don't want this to sound weird, but one of the great upsides to all of these disasters that we are having is like the opportunity to organize this way and to like build our communities in this way. And not like I'm saying that, oh, I'm so glad the hurricanes are here, because like, no, I'm not glad about that at all. But yeah, it's making me think that there's, so much opportunity for solidarity building in a way that like seems really real and liberatory.
A lot of us talked about that tension we were all kind of feeling that in this space, this tension of like something really terrible has happened. This is objectively terrible, like the people who have gotten hurt and the destruction of the hurricane itself. But then on the other hand, outside of that, or rather through that disaster, what happened was the normal everyday way of things kind of peeled off of the situation, and that unlocked so much potential in all of us. My friends down in Wilmington talked about how they were able to help 50 people, then 200 people, then 500 people, and about how this distro was able to continue to grow, and about how every day they wound up with more food than they started the day with, even though people were coming and freely taking whatever they needed from the distro. And it seems almost counterintuitive and paradoxical, but what these disasters afford us is an opportunity. I forget who says it, but there's an expression I always have in my mind that kind of goes, you only get stronger through confrontation with something stronger than you. In order to become stronger, you have to fight an opponent who is more skilled than you, and you have to rise to that occasion and develop yourself through experience and through practice and through challenge. And that's what these hurricanes and these disasters afford us. It's a moment when all of these artificial limits that have been placed on our bodies kind of get thrown to the wayside along with everything else. And we really have the opportunity to test our limits and see how far we can push ourselves to throw this way of life off and to start a different one.
That's super beautiful and well said, and definitely extremely inspiring. How can people help this space out? Like, if they're not in the area, is there a way to donate or a way to amplify, or what would you say?
I honestly think that as opposed to, money is always dope. And if y'all want to spend this money, that always feels great. Like, people here will appreciate it and will put it to good use. But I really kind of want to shout out the idea that other people in other towns should try to open as big a space as they possibly can, as often as they can, to organize mutual aid projects wherever they are. Sometimes I think we fall into this trap of finding something really cool and wanting to join in on the really cool thing and giving our energy to and money and resources to the really cool thing, as opposed to like seeing that one really cool space and then opening up our own really cool spaces where we can liberate ourselves and work on projects that feel important to us. So I think that instead of, people trying to, I guess, help this space, start your own. Open up your own space and start working on your own projects. Because when we have more and more spaces where we can find each other and work on these really cool projects and connect with one another across the entire terrain of North Carolina, like, that's when we're going to become really powerful. Because that's when we're going to become this network of spaces that can operate outside of the state and in a very resilient way.
Yeah, that's what's up.
And then, send us supplies for money also.
Yeah. How can people do that?
We have an address for the space. It's 800 Henderson Street, Durham, North Carolina. We also have a website, maddistronc.org, where you can see all of our donation links. We've got a Facebook, we've got a Twitter, we got an Instagram. We got an email and volunteer list if you want to sign up. So there's ways to plug into the space here in Durham for folks who are local, and for folks who are local, like totally come in and check out what the space is about. And for folks who aren't, start your own.
I love that. Sasha, thank you so much for this interview. I feel like you've just spoken really in depth about a lot of complex things and really nuanced this conversation of autonomous disaster relief, and, you know, given me at least like a lot to think about. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that, and for your work in the Triangle. That's all the questions that I have. Did you have anything that you wanted to add as part of this interview, or any like words you want to leave listeners with?
If I can, I just want to shout out all of the students and faculty and community members on UNC's campus who dealt with that Silent Sam bullshit, and all the defendants who are still dealing with it. I want to give a shout out to all the prisoners across so-called North Carolina who are dealing with repression right now after the prison strike. And I want to shout out to all the folks in Virginia and in New Orleans who are fighting against these motherfucking pipelines, because screw that. You know, I just want to send some love to all my other comrades who are working on the front lines in different struggles, because we are all connected and we're all fighting these fights together.
To get in touch with this project, and if you have extra bucks to spare, you can visit maddistronc.org for ways to donate. Or you can drop by to 800 Henderson Street in Durham if you're in the area. To hear the interview that we referenced about halfway through, you can go to our website and search Indigenous Activist, and it should be the first item in the search results. You can also hear a 10-minute edit of this interview in the October episode of Bad News and Angry Voices from Around the World, which you can find both at our website or at aradio.blogsport.de. I realize we didn't talk about the Silent Sam repression. Would you be willing to give like a brief rundown about repression in the area after the statue was pulled down?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Well, immediately after the statue came down, the State Bureau of Investigation got involved and began working with the university and local police departments across town. Some folks had their doors knocked on by cops who were trying to investigate and go out on fishing expeditions. Students and faculty were like pulled out of classrooms and told that they were being investigated. Some element of the university worked in cooperation with the police departments to give them information about students and about teachers. And
it's so horrible.
And, you know, arrests have happened since. They've happened, warrants have been handed out for the actual falling of the statue. And subsequent arrests have happened in all of the actions following the statue falling. So at the dance party that was held on campus in celebration of the statue collapsing, there were arrests. And during the food drive that happened on campus, there were even more arrests. And I really want to highlight the potluck, the food drive potluck event, because that was the demo where the smallest number of students and faculty and community members came out. And that was the demo where the police went the absolute hardest, where they were putting students and arrestees in like chokeholds and throwing them over tables and shoving them down onto the ground. They were at their most forceful at this event. And that had been following a good number of demos where the entire student body was chanting things like "fuck the police." So these cops were embarrassed and they were really pissed off, and then they saw the opportunity to go hard and they went hard. And I think what that illustrates is one, a growing tendency that I think people already are talking about of how at these like far right demos, the real force that we are going to have to encounter is not these like neo-Confederates and Nazis. It's going to be the police. And so I think that if we're going to continue to respond to these events with counter demos the way that we have been, we need to become really conscious of that, because what we're getting led into right now are situations where they show up because they know that we're going to respond, and they get to unleash the cops on us and make tons of arrests. Mm-hmm. It's a war of attrition right now, and they're trying to bleed us dry. So I think people need to just recognize that this is a strategic move that they are making and figure out how they want to deal with that.
Yeah.
And then we were talking about repression. Outside of the police repression, what I've been seeing in the courts is kind of the same thing that, we always see, which is prosecutors trying to depoliticize actions and bring it back to, quote, legality, right? That's what I saw in Maya Little's trial with the prosecution's method of approach. It was constant objections to the line of questioning from the defense on grounds of relevancy because, the meaning of a statue and whether or not the statue is racist and whether or not the statue exists as a form of hate speech. Mm-hmm. All of that is, quote, political, and none of that is supposedly relevant to the fact of it being smeared with paint and blood. And we keep seeing this happen in the courtrooms, I think, because they know that if people begin to view the law within a political framework, then they will see that the law is not some neutral thing. The law has a political content. The law has a political objective. It is never something that is neutral. And the fact that the law is the law matters when the law protects a material form of white supremacy on campus. And the fact that the law was broken is political. And so that needs to be talked about. And trying to keep it out of the courtroom is this very little clever method that prosecutors use to try and put on this spectacle. So I definitely think that dealing with that looks like pouring as much energy as we can into making these situations, political situations, making them polarizing to the point where people do see that it is a matter of sides. It is a matter of, standing with or against white supremacy, standing with or against racism and slavery.
I think that's really, really on point. And thanks for going into that. I know that was like kind of an off-the-cuff question.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that.
Hell yeah. Is there are you aware of any sort of material support efforts that are going on to support arrestees or people who are being harassed?
There are constant fill the court days during, or rather asks. Every time that one of the defendants has a hearing in court, people have been trying as best as they can to pack the courthouse with supporters so that at the very least, one, defendants know that they're not alone, and two, the prosecutors and the judges know that the defendants are not alone. And that's been really important and very helpful, I think. I know that fundraisers are always happening for their legal costs. And in terms of other concrete support, call-ins to the DA. There have been numerous call-in campaigns organized so far. I know that there are more happening. And I think that in general, if people continue to organize call-in parties on their own, where you and 5 of your friends get together and you kind of spend just, the day constantly calling the DA's office, trying to clog in the phone lines and disrupt the operations going on at the office. That is really going to also apply at least pressure in the sense that we're watching you. We're not going to let you just go about your day as normal, and we're not going away until these charges go away.
Definitely. And I think that stuff like that is super important because it's been materially shown that if the prison feels like they are not being scrutinized, or if the cops feel like they're not being scrutinized, this stuff goes way differently.
Yeah.
Than if they feel some kind of pressure from the public. So yeah, that's super, super important. Sasha, thank you so much for such a great and beautiful and detailed interview. I really appreciate the time that you've taken and the patience that you've had with all the technical errors. And yeah, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.